In the state of Texas, we have the largest cow-calf inventory in the nation. We have about 4.5 to 5 million head of cattle here in the state. We've had as high as 5.5 million head of cattle in the state. The drought and certainly limits the amount of cattle we can run because we are dependent on the natural resources, and we have to adjust our inventories to match that or we degrade those natural resources. So over time that number fluctuates. As we look at the beef cattle industry in the United States, and particularly in Texas, we look at the cows as a means of harvesting natural resources. The resources we have available to us here in the state are primarily pasture land or range land, forest land as well, that's really of no use for the production of food except through grazing ruminant animals. And we can harvest these forages using those animals, convert it into a sellable product and consumable product for our customers across the nation as well as the world. And so it's a very unique situation where we have this much pasture land, and the ruminant is a key component in the management of that natural resource. If you remove those animals from the resource management, then we have accumulation of dead material, creates a fire hazard. So there's a lot of things we use with ruminants and grazing animals to reduce really danger to humans, danger to ecosystems. Excessively hot fires can destroy ecosystems as well. So we use the grazing ruminant, particularly the cow in the state of Texas, to decrease those fuel loads and manage those natural resources to the better of the environment. And that's something we don't take enough time to explain to a lot of people, but it is one of those areas where beef cattle are critical in the resource management. There are rangelands in the western part and central part of the state that could not be farmed even if we wanted to. There's not enough water, there's not enough soil, there's not enough productivity to justify that. However, it's good at growing forages, and through proper rangeland management, we can use cattle to harvest that forage which otherwise would be wasted into the ecosystem. Once again, proper management is key, but natural resource management is the key focus of cow-calf production and any kind of livestock production in the state of Texas. We also have the largest feeding capacity in the world, or finishing of those cattle once they come off the growing and grass phases of our industry, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But that feedlot industry has about 2.5 million head of cattle on feed at any one point in time here in the state of Texas. That is the largest feeding group of any state, and so we try to match the production cycles as it progresses through the year with what our consumer demands are for beef, and it's a very complicated system. And when the beef industry, it's not a vertically integrated system where everything is planned out and coordinated. There's somewhere around 650 to 700,000 independent beef cattle producers in the nation. In Texas, there's estimated some 175,000 beef cattle producers, all of them very independent in the way they approach it, the types of livestock they use, when they have their cattle calving, or if they have calving seasons, how they market those cattle. It's a very independently run industry, and therefore it takes a little more coordination as we get further up the chain to make sure we control our inventory. We're kind of a segmented industry, with cow-calf being the largest sector here in the state. Those 5 million head of cattle, over 175,000 producers. The average herd size in the state of Texas is 49. There's that misconception that all the ranches in Texas are large, but we're not very much different than the rest of the nation. We are a little bit larger in average size, maybe by 20 head than the rest of the nation. We have the largest contiguous ranching operation in the nation, in the Wagner Ranch here in Texas. We have the largest ranching operation in the nation in the King Ranch here in Texas, but we also have tremendous number of very small operators. In fact, right at 50% of the beef cattle produced in the United States is produced in operation with less than 100 head of cattle. And so when we look at that, it's a very interesting mix of how cattle are produced, who produces them, and how we come up with these high quality beef products at the end. At weaning time, when they're taking off the cows, they then go into what we call a stocker phase. Not all the cattle, but most of the cattle will go into an additional phase where they're grown to heavier weights on grass. Most of the time in Texas, the calves are weaned somewhere between 450 pounds and 500 pounds. That's somewhere around 7 to 8 months of age. Then they go through a stocker phase from that 450 to 500 pounds, and we'll grow them on grass and other crop residue perhaps, up to 750 to 800 pounds, and then we'll go into a finishing phase. And in Texas, that's primarily feeding of additional corn and byproducts and silage to those cattle. Once again, it's a fairly high roughage diet that those cattle go into, and was estimated probably 80% of the weight that we sell in beef cattle is generated from the consumption of forages. And that's another misconception about our industry, that it's all high grain feeding to livestock. These finishing operations will take those calves from weighing 750 to 850 pounds and grow those cattle up until they're 1,200 to 1,400 pounds kind of on average. There's some bigger, some smaller, because everybody's independent in the type of cattle they produce.
And so let's talk a little bit about the stocker side. And as those cattle move from the ranch into a grazing segment, essentially those calves are put back out on ranches across the United States. They're put out on grass, and forage is the predominant resource for those calves. And the main reason is because it's a very economical source of nutrients, and those cattle can get some fairly efficient economical gains before they move into the finishing phase of it. And those calves they graze a lot of different varieties. A real common one would be wheat pasture or oats or ryegrass or some kind of clovers or legumes. Those would be in the winter and spring, all the way to maybe some fields that have been cropped, and they're grazing some of the crop residues out there. Or they could be, they were put out on summer pastures, some native pastures and those kind of things. One of the unique things about cattle is that they are ruminant. And with ruminants, they can take plant material that's not necessarily suited for human consumption or even just monogastric consumption, but they can take that forage, that grass, either a high quality grass or even some of the lowest quality grass. They can take that forage, consume it, and convert it into really ultimately a beef product for us humans to consume. And as we look at the feed yard, it's important to realize that in the feed yard, a lot of people involved in the production of those cattle in there, a lot of people observing the health, what their performance is of those cattle. Our feed yards have got consulting veterinarians that are there on standby to treat any of the health needs of those cattle if they do get sick. In addition to a veterinarian that's always on standby in those feed yards, they also have consulting nutritionists who are there to make sure that the dietary needs of those cattle are met, again for the well-being, but ultimately so that those cattle will gain well and perform well and do well so that we can have a good quality product. And from a business standpoint, we need to make sure it makes sense and those cattle do perform and do make money for the owners of those animals. What are some of the reasons why we utilize a grain-based diet in the final 100 to 150 days of a steer or heifer that's going to ultimately go into beef? Why do we utilize grain-based diets? And there's a number of reasons, but an important reason is the flavor. If we utilize a grain or corn, for example, in the diet of those cattle, regardless of where that animal is on feed, they're going to have a consistent diet. And ultimately, we understand from research that whatever cattle eat will ultimately impart flavors in the meat from those animals. And so if we utilize corn or grain, the flavors are going to be consistent no matter where that animal's produced. On the flip side, if we compare it to grass, and when we think about grass, we've got grasses of all different varieties across the United States. The reason for that is because there's a lot of differences in environmental growing conditions, soil types, weather conditions, and those. So lots of different grasses, different types of grasses, different qualities of grasses and forages. They're going to have different tastes. If we look at salad and we consume salad, different lettuces, spinach, you name it, they've got different flavors and impart different flavors on the salads that we eat as humans. Okay? Cattle, we look at all the grasses that they eat and the different types of grasses that they eat. Those grasses are going to have different flavors and different compounds in them. The cattle consume it, they take up those flavors in the meat and into the marbling of that product, and so they're going to impart different flavors. And so cattle from one area of the United States may have a different flavor than some of the other areas. And so an important reason that we do grain feed cattle is because we do get a consistent, a really good grain-fed flavor to the steaks or the hamburger, whatever we're producing from them. When we think about the cattle business from top to bottom, all the way from the cow-calf to the stocker to the feeding, so the production side of the beef business, okay, the way that we produce that product and get it ready to move on and to be turned into a steak, it's important that us as beef cattle producers, whichever segment that we're in, we all understand that, one, food safety is utmost important, because ultimately somebody's going to be eating the product that we're producing. And that somebody could be my son or somebody else's son, or it could be somebody's grandkid or an adult. It doesn't matter. But there's consumers and somebody's going to be eating that product, so we need to make sure that it's a safe product, number one. That's always first and foremost. The second thing is, from a beef cattle production standpoint, we produce a quality product. And that's the way that we sell our product. That's the way we sell beef, based on quality and a quality eating experience. And our ranchers understand that. They understand the importance, making sure that we're producing the best quality beef that we can, because if not, somebody's going to go to a cheaper protein source that doesn't have the flavor, doesn't have the eating experience that beef would have.